These evolving capabilities raise fundamental questions about the legal frameworks governing such operations, particularly when they cross international boundaries and affect civilian populations across multiple nations simultaneously. International legal frameworks and compliance. Current international laws governing psychological operations were written decades before digital warfare capabilities existed, creating massive regulatory gaps that intelligence agencies exploit daily. The Geneva Conventions, established in 1949, focus on physical warfare and direct military confrontation, while failing to address psychological manipulation conducted through social media platforms and artificial intelligence systems. The Convention Against Torture prohibits psychological torture, but defines torture narrowly requiring direct state custody, while modern psychological operations manipulate individuals without physical detention. International humanitarian law defines combatants and civilians based on physical presence and military affiliation concepts that become meaningless when psychological operations target entire populations through their personal devices and social media accounts. Existing international laws struggle to address modern digital psychological warfare because traditional legal frameworks assume geographic boundaries and identifiable state actors, while cyber-psychological operations transcend borders invisibly through internet infrastructure owned by private companies. The United Nations Charter prohibits interference in domestic affairs of sovereign nations, but psychological operations conducted through social media platforms operate in legal grey areas where jurisdiction remains unclear. International law requires proof of state responsibility for aggressive actions, but psychological warfare uses plausible deniability techniques that make attribution nearly impossible through bot networks and proxy operations. Legal grey areas create jurisdictional nightmares where psychological operations targeting citizens from foreign servers face no clear legal authority for investigation or prosecution. Digital psychological warfare crosses multiple national boundaries within milliseconds, making traditional jurisdictional concepts obsolete when operations target users in dozens of countries simultaneously through global social media platforms. Private companies hosting psychological warfare infrastructure face conflicting legal obligations under different national laws, with some countries requiring cooperation with intelligence agencies, while others prohibit psychological manipulation of their citizens. Regulatory challenges multiply when psychological operations use artificial intelligence systems hosted in countries with different legal frameworks for data protection and psychological manipulation. International law enforcement agencies lack technical expertise and legal authority to investigate cross-border psychological warfare that operates through encrypted communications and anonymous networks. Victims of psychological operations cannot identify the source of manipulation, making civil legal remedies impossible, while criminal prosecution requires evidence that digital psychological warfare techniques are designed to obscure. Compliance mechanisms face fundamental enforcement challenges because international law relies on state cooperation, while psychological operations specifically exploit state sovereignty principles to avoid accountability. The International Court of Justice lacks jurisdiction over intelligence operations that states classify as national security activities, exempt from international legal review. United Nations Security Council resolutions require consensus among permanent members who themselves conduct psychological operations, making meaningful regulatory action impossible. Different nations interpret psychological operation regulations through vastly different legal and cultural frameworks that create inconsistent international standards for acceptable psychological influence activities. European Union data protection regulations attempt to limit psychological manipulation through commercial platforms, but contain national security exceptions that intelligence agencies exploit for psychological operations. China maintains that psychological influence operations represent legitimate information warfare, while Western nations classify similar activities as illegal interference in democratic processes. Russia argues that psychological warfare constitutes defensive measures against Western cultural imperialism, while NATO countries consider Russian psychological operations as attacks on democratic institutions. National implementation varies dramatically, with some countries criminalizing foreign psychological influence, while conducting similar operations against other nations, creating diplomatic double standards. Constitutional protections for free speech in democratic countries complicate regulation of psychological operations that use protected communications platforms to conduct influence campaigns. Authoritarian governments use psychological operation regulations to suppress legitimate political opposition while conducting extensive psychological warfare against their own populations and foreign targets. Diplomatic implications include deteriorating international relations as nations accuse each other of conducting psychological warfare while maintaining official denials about their own psychological operation activities. International disputes arise when psychological operations influence electoral processes in democratic countries, leading to sanctions and diplomatic protests that damage bilateral relationships. Alliance structures face strain when psychological operations target partner nations, creating conflicts between intelligence cooperation obligations and sovereignty protection principles. The International Court of Justice received formal complaints about psychological warfare affecting electoral processes, with preliminary rulings suggesting potential jurisdiction over large-scale psychological operations that threaten state sovereignty. Regional human rights courts examine individual cases of psychological manipulation, seeking to establish legal precedents for digital psychological warfare accountability. International arbitration provides mechanisms for resolving disputes between nations regarding psychological operation damages and compensation claims. These legal framework limitations have created an environment where psychological operations continue, expanding in scope and sophistication, while operating largely outside meaningful international oversight. The regulatory vacuum enables intelligence agencies to develop increasingly advanced psychological manipulation capabilities without adequate legal constraints or accountability mechanisms. As these operations become more sophisticated and widespread, the gap between existing legal frameworks and operational realities continues widening. The absence of effective international legal governance has prompted intelligence communities to push the boundaries of psychological manipulation technology even further. Current legal limitations provide little deterrent against developing more advanced psychological warfare capabilities that could fundamentally transform how these operations affect human behavior and decision-making processes. Intelligence analysts recognize that this regulatory environment creates opportunities for dramatic technological advancement in psychological operations that could reshape the entire landscape of psychological warfare on future psychological operations. Intelligence community experts and former CIA operatives provide detailed analysis of how psychological operations will continue evolving through technological advancement and operational refinement over the next decade. Leading intelligence analysts predict that artificial intelligence systems will achieve unprecedented precision in targeting individual psychological vulnerabilities, while expanding operational scale to influence hundreds of millions of people simultaneously through coordinated digital campaigns. Dr. Sarah Chun from the National Security Technology Institute estimates that machine learning algorithms will become sophisticated enough by 2027 to predict individual behavioral responses with remarkable accuracy based on comprehensive digital footprint analysis. Former CIA psychological operations specialist Michael Rodriguez projects that AI-enhanced influence campaigns will reach deployment capabilities by 2028 that allow real-time psychological manipulation adjustments based on continuous behavioral feedback monitoring. The integration of advanced artificial intelligence represents the most significant technological advancement expected to transform psychological warfare capabilities within the coming decade. Enhanced machine learning systems will process behavioral data from millions of individuals simultaneously to identify optimal psychological influence strategies for different demographic groups and individual targets. These AI systems will create personalized psychological manipulation approaches that adapt continuously based on real-time feedback from target responses measured through social media engagement patterns, communication style changes, and decision-making behavior modifications. Artificial intelligence will enable psychological operations to achieve mathematical precision in predicting and influencing human behavior through algorithmic analysis of psychological patterns that human analysts could never identify or process at comparable scale. Predictive modeling capabilities will advance significantly through AI systems that can forecast individual psychological responses to specific influence techniques before implementing actual psychological pressure campaigns. These systems will analyze historical psychological operation data, combined with individual behavioral profiles, to determine optimal timing, messaging, and psychological pressure intensity for maximum influence effectiveness. Machine learning algorithms will identify psychological vulnerability patterns across different personality types, cultural backgrounds, and demographic categories, enabling more precise targeting of influence operations. The AI systems will predict which psychological approaches will achieve desired behavioral modifications while minimizing detection risks and psychological resistance responses. Enhanced targeting precision will emerge through artificial intelligence systems that can identify subtle psychological indicators and behavioral patterns that reveal individual susceptibility to different types of psychological manipulation. These systems will analyze communication patterns, decision-making processes, social interaction behaviors, and emotional response indicators to create comprehensive psychological vulnerability assessments for millions of individuals simultaneously. AI-driven psychological profiling will identify optimal influence approaches for each target based on their demonstrated psychological triggers, cognitive biases, and emotional response patterns gathered through years of digital behavioral monitoring. The precision capabilities will enable psychological operations to achieve higher success rates while reducing resource investment and operational risks. Scale expansion represents another critical advancement, as artificial intelligence enables psychological operations to target entire populations through coordinated influence campaigns that would require thousands of human analysts using traditional methods. AI systems will manage hundreds of simultaneous psychological operations across multiple platforms and demographic groups, while maintaining consistent messaging and coordinating timing for maximum psychological impact. These systems will process real-time feedback from millions of targets simultaneously and adjust psychological pressure techniques across entire campaigns within minutes, based on effectiveness measurements and resistance indicators. The scale capabilities will enable intelligence agencies to influence political sentiment, consumer behavior, and social attitudes across entire nations through comprehensive psychological manipulation campaigns. Automation advances will reduce human oversight requirements while increasing operational speed and consistency in psychological manipulation techniques. AI systems will generate psychological content, manage fake account networks, coordinate bot amplification, and measure campaign effectiveness without requiring human intervention for routine operational decisions. Automated psychological operations will respond to changing conditions and target behaviors faster than human-controlled campaigns, while maintaining consistent psychological pressure approaches across extended time periods. The automation will enable psychological operations to run continuously across multiple time zones and demographic groups, while adapting to local cultural contexts and individual psychological profiles automatically. Detection avoidance capabilities will improve significantly through AI systems designed to create psychological manipulation content that appears completely organic to both human targets and platform security systems. Machine learning algorithms will analyze successful psychological influence techniques and generate new approaches that avoid detection patterns identified by counterintelligence systems. AI-generated psychological content will incorporate natural language variations, cultural references, and behavioral patterns that make influence campaigns indistinguishable from authentic user-generated content. These detection avoidance capabilities will enable psychological operations to maintain longer campaign durations and achieve deeper psychological influence without triggering security responses from targeted platforms or government oversight systems. Cross-platform coordination will advance through AI systems that can manage psychological influence campaigns across dozens of social media platforms simultaneously, while maintaining consistent messaging adapted for each platform's specific user engagement patterns and algorithmic requirements. These systems will coordinate timing, content distribution, and amplification techniques across multiple digital environments to create comprehensive psychological influence ecosystems that surround targets with consistent psychological pressure from multiple sources. The coordination capabilities will enable psychological operations to achieve cumulative influence effects that exceed the effectiveness of single-platform campaigns, while maintaining operational security across diverse digital environments. International implications include the development of competing AI-enhanced psychological warfare capabilities by foreign intelligence agencies, creating technological arms races in psychological manipulation techniques. Nations will invest heavily in defensive AI systems designed to detect and counter foreign psychological influence campaigns, while developing offensive capabilities that can penetrate enemy psychological defenses. The advancement of AI-powered psychological operations will require new international cooperation frameworks for managing cross-border psychological warfare and establishing ethical boundaries for artificial intelligence applications in psychological manipulation. Expert consensus indicates that these AI-enhanced psychological operations will achieve initial deployment within the next 5 years, with full operational capabilities expected by 2030. The technological foundation already exists through current machine learning systems and social media platforms, with continued advancement requiring primarily software development and data integration rather than fundamental technological breakthroughs. Intelligence agencies recognize that artificial intelligence represents the future of psychological warfare, with traditional human-controlled operations becoming obsolete for large-scale influence campaigns. These expert predictions reveal psychological operations capabilities that will fundamentally transform how intelligence agencies influence human behavior and decision-making processes across global populations. The scope and sophistication of these emerging capabilities suggests psychological manipulation will become an invisible but pervasive element of digital life, affecting millions of people who remain completely unaware of the influence operations surrounding them. The comprehensive analysis reveals that digital psychological influence operates on a scale and with a level of invisibility that traditional methods never achieved. Every scroll through your timeline potentially exposes you to psychological manipulation designed by intelligence specialists using sophisticated systems that analyze your vulnerabilities through continuous behavioral monitoring. The invisible nature of these operations means you participate in your own psychological manipulation by sharing content and engaging with materials specifically created to influence your thoughts and behaviors. Recognizing these manipulation techniques in your digital experiences requires understanding how your online activities create psychological profiles that intelligence agencies exploit through personalized influence campaigns, targeting your specific emotional triggers and decision-making patterns.